Welcome everyone to our first in the 2021 Online Ethics Center webinar series, Bringing Ethics into the Conversation, where faculty and students, administrators and professionals in engineering and science come together for engaging conversations about teaching ethics. I am Rosalyn Berne, Director of the Online Ethics Center, the OEC, and faculty member in the Department of Engineering and Science of the University of Virginia's School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. Our conversation today is on giving voice to values, or GVV, a curriculum designed to help students to recognize, clarify, speak, and act on their values when conflicts arise. With us here is Mary Gentile, Ph.D., creator and director of Giving Voice to Values. GVV has been featured in publications such as Financial Times, Harvard Business Review, and Stanford Social Innovation Review, and has been piloted in over 1,260 business schools and organizations globally. Dr. Gentile is currently a professor of practice at the University of Virginia's Darden School of Business and a senior advisor at the Aspen Institute Business and Society program. She is collaborating with the OEC on an adaptation of her GVV course specifically for engineering. Once complete, that course will be made available at no charge through the OEC for students and faculty members. Thank you, Dr. Gentile, for being a guest lecturer in this series.
Happy to be here.
Dr. Gentile's discussant is Dr. Richard K. Miller, who was appointed president and first employee of Olin College of Engineering in 1999. Olin was founded to radically change engineering education with the goal of fueling the technical innovation needed to solve the world's complex future challenges. Before joining Olin, Dr. Miller served as Dean of the College of Engineering at the University of Iowa. Previous to that, he was on the engineering faculty at USC in Los Angeles and UCSB in Santa Barbara. Welcome, Dr. Miller.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much for being with us. And welcome also to all of you who are here as participants in the webinar. We're delighted to have you with us. So please, I'll recede and look forward to an exciting conversation.
Thanks, Roz.
Thank you, Roz. Maybe I should start off as an interviewer of Mary. Mary has been such a great voice in understanding the importance of ethics for decades now. I remember first meeting her when I was teaching a course some years ago, jointly between Olin College, Babson College, and Wellesley, and we had her as a guest speaker, and she literally changed the entire shape of the course with what she's doing. So Mary, maybe you could start off by explaining to us, what is giving voice to values and where did it come from? Because it's a very different way of thinking about ethics than what most traditional courses do.
Thanks, Rick. Yeah, I'd be happy to. And I have very fond memories of teaching in that course with you too. But giving voice to values, or GVV, as I think Roz said in her introduction, is a new approach, an innovative approach to values-driven leadership development. And I created it for use in graduate business programs and MBA programs. But what's happened is that it's actually grown well beyond that in the, I guess, about 10 years now that it's been around, 10 or 12 years. It's certainly being used in business schools all over the world and increasingly in many major corporations as well as small companies. But then it started to migrate across professions. And so I had the opportunity to share it at School of Engineering with you. I'm working with Roz now at UVA School of Engineering. We've shared it with in legal education, medical schools, nursing schools. We've worked with NGOs, United Nations, a lot of different organizations. But let me tell you briefly what it is. I tell people, if you don't remember anything else about giving voice to values, it's about asking and answering a new question, a different question when it comes to ethics and values in our professional lives. So the usual question we try to answer in business ethics and engineering ethics, medical ethics, is what is the right thing to do in any particular situation? That's a hugely important question. And it is one that typically is focused on when we have those courses. But what GVV is about asking and answering a different question. It's about asking the question, once you know what you believe the right thing to do is, how could you get it done effectively? And this frankly grew out of my own experience when I was helping to design and teach in the first required ethics curriculum at Harvard Business School. And I was also working with other business schools and businesses around the world. And the way we tended to approach ethics was, in fact, to answer that first question. It was as if it was entirely a cognitive problem, and if you gave me the right sort of black box and I put the data in one side, the right answer would come out the other end, and then I'd be done. And I call that the preach and pretend method. I preach to you about what's right, and then I pretend that you could do it or that you'd be comfortable doing it or that you'd be effective doing it. I began to be quite disillusioned. I began to think that this was kind of futile and even somewhat hypocritical. It seemed like there were, every few years there'd be a spate of scandals. We would try and reassess the business curriculum. We'd develop new courses or new research, but the same thing kept happening over and over again. I remember being invited to speak at the Markula Center for Professional Ethics at the University of Santa Clara at that time. This was, back in the late 90s, this was. And they were hosting a debate where they were going to have two people on one side of the debate saying, after a quarter of a century of good faith efforts trying to address ethics in business, we've made a huge amount of progress. And then they had two people on the other side of the debate saying, we haven't made any progress. And on that negative side, they had Milton Friedman's son. But they asked me to be on the positive side. And I had this moment. It was kind of a watershed moment, where I thought, can I really lie on an ethics panel? Because I felt that, of course, as educators, we all know there are individuals that we've had an impact on. But I really couldn't say that more broadly we were having the kind of impact that we thought we wanted to have. And then I would see what happened in the classroom. And I venture to guess that some of this happens when you have an engineering ethics conversation as well, although you all can tell me if this isn't true. But, we would have these conversations. We'd maybe give people scenarios. We'd ask them to read them. And then the students would come into the classroom, or if it was in a business, the managers would come into the training room and they'd have an idea of what they thought the right answer was. But then in the course of the conversation, two things would happen. The first thing that would happen is that their thinking would become more complex. They'd begin to realize that maybe they didn't have all the information, or maybe this was pretty standard operating procedure in a lot of organizations or functions or industries or even parts of the world. Or, maybe it was wrong, but really, if they were going to do something, they were not likely to be effective, and they might even make things worse. And so their thinking would get more complicated. I actually think that's a good thing. You don't want people to walk into these situations naively. But the second thing that would happen would be more troubling to me. I don't know if you have this experience in your classrooms, but when I'm in a classroom or when I'm in a corporate training session, usually there's a few people that when they speak, everyone turns to listen to them. They might be the most articulate, they might be the wittiest. In a corporate setting, they're usually the people in the highest rank. But whatever it is, when they speak, everyone will listen. And I would find that they were often the ones who were voicing the most skeptical, if not cynical positions. The ones who were saying, Mary, I know what you want me to say, but it's just not feasible. It's just not in the real world. You can't do that. So I began to think that people were walking out of these sessions more confused and less empowered. And that just didn't feel like it was, worth my time, right? Life is short. I got skills. I'm going to do something else. But around that time, I had a lot of different experiences. And I also came across a lot of research, which actually changed the way I approach this. So let me tell you very quickly about some of the research. First of all, I came across some research that had been done by two different scholars on what they were calling moral conviction. They wanted to look at people who acted with great courage in times of high stakes. And they both independently, they were doing qualitative research, but they both independently decided they were going to do in-depth interviews with people who were referred to as rescuers from World War II. So these are people who put their lives at risk to help others during the Holocaust. And they found that, sure enough, these people had some common experiences. They were looking to see if they'd had different life experiences, family upbringing, education, religion, whatever. And they found a number of features, but the one that really resonated with me is that they found that the people who did this all reported that at an earlier point in their lives, usually as a young adult, they'd had the experience with someone more senior to them. So a boss or a teacher or a mentor, even a parent, they'd had the experience of rehearsing out loud, what would you do if, and then various kinds of moral conflicts. So they had this experience of literally pre-scripting and voicing and rehearsing. And of course, they couldn't have anticipated the Holocaust, but they had an experience that was both at the cognitive, but also the behavioral level. So at the cognitive level, they had actually named the value that mattered to them. They'd put a set of words to it, an articulation. And at the behavioral level, they'd had the experience of literally voicing it out loud to someone more senior to them, who stood in as proxy for the kind of person they would need to speak with in the actual circumstances. So that's what got me thinking about research, rehearsal, pre-scripting. And I started to see that there was research in psychology. There's more and more research around habit formation. There's actually a school of research in psychology that looks at they study what they call positive deviance. So these are people who deviate from the norm, but in a positive direction. And they've got a great phrase. It's their phrase. They say, if you want to have an impact on people's behavior, rather than asking them to think their way into a different way of acting, it's more effective to ask them to act their way into a different way of thinking. So I thought, well, that was kind of interesting. And then there's been, I'm sure you've seen the popularizations of all sorts of new research in the fields of cognitive neurosciences. And they talk about brain plasticity and creating new neural pathways. But the research I want to tell the quick story about, because I think it really captures this, comes from the field of kinesthetics, or the study of physical movement. So back in the day when I was still working at Harvard Business School, I decided to take a self-defense class. I actually never had felt the need to take one until I went to work at Harvard Business School, but that's another story. So I looked around Boston, and there were a lot of these courses, and they all teach you pretty much the same thing, the physical moves. Fist to bridge of nose and heel to instep and knee to groin, and you practice them in the air. But there was one course that was different. It was called model mugging. And they would bring in a gentleman in a padded, first it was a developmental model, so they'd teach you all the moves. But then after you knew the moves, they bring in a gentleman in a padded suit, like the Michelin Man. And they would line us all up, and we would take turns getting attacked full force. And then you could use these moves on him full force because he was protected. And in the beginning, it was kind of ludicrous, but you just stood there waiting your turn to get attacked. But by the week after week, eventually I'd be talking to you, he would come and grab me. I would never know when, I would never know what hold he was going to use. It was really nerve-wracking. But they explained to us that this was based on this idea of specific state muscle memory. So the idea was, if you rehearse something in the same physiological and emotional and cognitive state that you'll be in when you need to use it, that even if you freeze in that moment, your body remembers, so the tennis pro practices her serve over and over before she goes to tournament. And then when she's there under all that stress, her body just naturally assumes the proper form. So I am in this class lying on my back on the floor, having failed to protect myself. And I'm thinking, could you create a kind of moral muscle memory? Could you create a kind of default to voice, but not just to speaking up, but default to informed voice? Because what I was learning from my other explorations, which were interviewing hundreds of people, gathering hundreds of stories of people who had voiced their values, is that it wasn't about whistleblowing. It wasn't about, telling your boss that he or she is evil. It was really about being much more tactical, much more strategic, using all the same skills you would use to, solve any problem, but applying them to a values-based issue. So that was the beginning of GVV. I thought, let's create a curriculum that's not just focused on making you aware of ethical issues, that's important, and not just focused on making you aware of aware of how to analyze ethical issues, that's important, but also focuses on action, which is once you know what's right, how do you get it done effectively? So that's kind of the heart of it.
That's marvelous. And I can attest to the accuracy of what you're saying about this changing everything in the way people behave, and then they're creating their readiness to act by having seen it in the classroom with our own students when we use this method. So I know it works. And I totally agree with you that more of the problem is not in knowing what to do, but knowing what to do about it and feeling confident that you can do that. So I'm amazed. Now, you started this in a business format, but you said that in recent years, it's spread to medicine and to law and to all of these other fields as well. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, it's kind of a surprise to me, frankly, and it was a surprise to me that it's also been picked up so much globally, in cultures that people said this will never work. I think there's a number of reasons. I think one of the reasons is that it's such a powerful yet very accessible idea. It kind of makes sense to people that, you could get more comfortable at doing this if you rehearsed. And in organizational settings, they like it because it's action focused. And they also like it because they see that it's really not just about only ethical challenges, it's about any kind of leadership challenge. When I brought this to McKinsey, it was their leadership groups that wanted to bring it, because they see it's about being able to have conversations about things that may be challenging to talk about, But the other thing that I think makes it work is that in so many professions, people often, there are those issues that are truly complex and gray and fuzzy, and it's a little bit this and a little bit that. But there are other places where a lot of us actually know what the right thing to do is. And so what this is about is actually, if we could get better at addressing those issues, have gone a huge distance in addressing a lot of the most difficult problems. And also, I think it makes people better at having the conversation about the gray issues, because they've actually brought the emotion down. One of the pillars of giving voice to values is something we call normalization, where we kind of say, this is not exceptional. These things happen every day, And so we might as well get good at dealing with them rather than figuring that we have to just close our eyes and rush past them and, just do the easiest thing. It's actually interesting. There's been some other research, again, in behavioral ethics and psychology, but that looks at how people actually address issues. And they say that when people encounter values conflicts, they don't usually sit down and sort of make a pro and con list or ask what would John Rawls say or what would Aristotle say. They actually tend to react emotionally in the moment, automatically, unconsciously, and then rationalize after the fact why it was the right thing to do or why it was the only thing to do. And so what I wanted to do was to create a methodology that actually rewired that connection, that by having people practice this and using what we call the giving voice to values thought experiment, where I never ask people, what would you do? Instead, I ask, what if you were this person who has decided this is what they think the right thing to do is? How could they get it done? It triggers a different part of your brain, and it actually gets you into your problem solving mode. And I think that's been attractive too to people in other professions, because they don't feel like they're being preached to. I remember the first time I went and talked to medical school professors, they were saying, it's hard to talk about ethics in medical school because people feel like they're already being really good people by becoming doctors, And some of what I feel with engineering is, as you yourself have said, you have that great line where you say nature doesn't give partial credit. I mean, there are certain things that you just know. It's part of the knowledge, the content that you learn as an engineer. But that doesn't mean that you're not going to, most engineers are working in a business context. That doesn't mean you're not going to feel pressures to, sort of slide out around on some of the safety issues or the quality issues, or even if you bring them up, to be overruled, and then people become discouraged and people become disillusioned and cynical. It's been interesting reading some of the emails in the Boeing situation, where you hear the kind of pain and then cynicism on the part of people who knew something was a problem but knew they weren't going to get listened to. And so I think that it makes sense that having people learn to talk about these things in other professions is just as important. I also think some of the objections that faculty have felt to raising issues in business schools are common in other professions as well.
Yeah, that's very helpful. One other question is, and I'll put this in the context of my own experience in history, is how faculty members feel about their competence in doing this. So I know some years ago when I started that course that we were talking about, we knew that in the engineering curriculum, the accreditation board requires that engineers be exposed to principles of ethics in the professions and in engineering. And we had a small faculty at the time, and we basically said, so who wants to teach that? And no.
Do you get a lot of hands?
Yeah, nobody wanted to touch that. And basically, because of an absence of anyone else willing to do it, I stepped into the breach and said, well, I guess I'm going to have to figure this out. The question was, I don't have a PhD in ethics. I don't have a PhD in psychology. Who am I to stand in front of these people and to tell them this is what you should do? This is not an insignificant barrier to getting comfortable with the idea of incorporating this in your class. Do you have any advice for faculty in engineering? By the way, engineering faculty have a lot of similarities with people in applied physics or mathematics. Almost everything that we learn is cognitive. We even have trouble talking to professional engineers who make things, because most of us on the faculty get promoted because of the papers we wrote, not because of the things that we built. So getting over that barrier is not easy.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, there were 4 or 5 objections that I encountered from faculty that I actually designed GVV specifically to try and address. Partly because one of my jobs when I was at Harvard Business School was to help the non-ethics faculty integrate ethics into their teaching, not the non-ethical faculty, but the non-ethics faculty. So these were like finance and economics and marketing, and people who were not treading in that area. So the first objection you hear is, I'm not a philosopher, as you were just saying. This is not my area of expertise. And faculty, our self-worth is our expertise, right? So, that was understandable. And that was one of the ways in which GVV helps, because it's post-decision making. The cases are about a situation where someone is not weighing what's right. They're weighing how to get it done. And then the second objection that you get is, well, in ethics discussions, there's no takeaway, there's no deliverable, there's no right answer. It's this endless debate, which for some people is fun, but for a lot of people is, it's like, my meter's running. What am I getting out of this? And we tried to address that with GVV as well, because not only are we post-decision making, but we're asking people to use the language and the analytics, the tools, the vocabulary of their field to make a case for why this would be the appropriate thing to do. So in business, this often meant making cases that had to do with effective organizational practices, or effective auditing practices, or effective financial calculations and practices. In engineering, it would be similar, but you'd be using the language of your discipline to make the case. And so that was part of why that was addressed. Another thing we heard from faculty is, I don't want to preach because it's not effective and I get bad ratings, and that's another place where, we're not asking anyone to preach. We're just saying, what if you wanted to do this? How could you get it done? And then we also hear from people, I don't want to pretend they're not going to be faced with these issues. I don't want to act like the world is this rosy place where you don't have these ethical conflicts. So again, we've sort of addressed that, because we're saying we would like to do something. We know it's going to be challenging. How can you use your tools, the skills you have? And then finally, we get the crowded syllabus question. It's like, I have an ethical obligation to teach discounted cash flow. I can't crowd that out to talk about this. And so again, people are using the tools of their discipline to make the case. And it's been interesting to me because some of the companies that we have found most welcoming of this are in fact engineering companies. I mean, the first company to use GVV, and they came to me, I didn't approach them, was Lockheed Martin. And so many of their scenarios are very much engineering scenarios. They have to do with quality, they have to do with safety, they have to do with standards in their manufacturing. They also have financial challenges, but there are many of them that are engineering based. So I think those are some of the ways that we try and help faculty get around that. I think it's also not as daunting because what you're doing when your student is bringing these are, we call them giving voice to values thought experiments, our cases. So the question is, how could someone get this done? When the student is sharing their approach, you're evaluating it from your knowledge base as a marketer, a financial manager, or an engineer, and saying whether that makes sense, whether that's credible, whether that is actually something that could be heard. And so I think for all those reasons, we've found that faculty in other disciplines actually don't feel like they're taking time out for philosophy.
Mm-hmm. I can sure see that. One of the other issues that people in engineering who haven't thought much about this will have is how much time and dwell does it take to move the needle? Because often in engineering, what happens, we have to do this because it's dealing with society, it's not differential equations. Okay, so let's stick it in the design course because we have to do a project at some point. So everything gets stuck into the design course. And it's on a checklist of, did you consider ethical issues before you built this thing? And we'll talk about that for a day or 2 days, maybe even do a workshop. And then we put a check in that box and say, we're done. That's kind of the minimalist approach. It's, I think, probably the practical approach for a lot of schools. The other thing is cultural approaches would start on the first day that students arrive. They would have an honor code that they would talk through. What does this mean in everything that you do? It's woven into the curriculum in every course, and faculty members don't hesitate to talk about what they would do. And it winds up being part of the fabric of the institution. Is that necessary? Where do you see the line at which good outcomes can be expected? And it's probably not a fair question, but people will have.
It's the important question, and it's important in other fields as well. I mean, that's the question I would get in business schools as well, because they would sort of do the same models that you're talking about. I mean, obviously, in an ideal world, it's great that it gets integrated throughout the curriculum so that people don't think it's time out for ethics, and understand about the time pressures, though. And so one of the ways and as well as the issues I talked about earlier in terms of feeling of confidence on the part of the faculty. But in terms of time pressure, the way we develop this is there's lots of different ways to do it that can be very economical. So first of all, the concept itself, sort of the approach itself, and some of the tools and the protocol of questions that we use, it's pretty easy to capture. You can kind of introduce it in a few hours. And it's something that in some schools, for example, it can be introduced in orientation or in one of the first classes where people just learn the approach, or in something outside of class where they just learn the methodology. And then faculty who are teaching in any particular course, they can develop new cases or use cases that are specifically designed this way, or they can use the cases they already teach that may have a potential values issue in it that doesn't usually get addressed. And then it can be a pasture of discussion at some point in the course where you say, okay, now what if you were going to do this? How would you get this done? What would be the most persuasive ways to influence the people? Who do you think would be resistant, and how might you address it? It can also be done. Most of the time, people have students prepare these outside of class and then come and share them and present them in class. And what happens in class is more of a peer coaching to refine and enhance the approaches. Sometimes they're even as written papers. One school actually had a capstone course where they always had the students do a case. And so they had the students do the solution to the case using a GVV methodology. So all students got it. They'd been introduced to it earlier on. You don't need to put this everywhere. I've found that it gets repetitious, because what you'll find is that the kinds of rationalizations and arguments you encounter get repetitious pretty quickly, and people start to develop the skill of answering them. There's some recognizable ones, it's standard operating procedure, it's not material, it's not a big enough deal, it's not my responsibility, it's my boss's, those kinds of things. And once you've practiced them a few times, you don't have to do it all the time. So, one school actually introduced it at the beginning and then integrated it, I think it was like 3 or 4 times throughout the course of the program, and then had that capstone exercise. And so it's not like something you do every day. It's not like you need a module in every class. But I work with people to figure out what makes sense.
Well, I can see it's about time for us to go to questions, but I just have one other comment on this that I think might be interesting. In dealing with this as an engineer and the literature, it occurred to me that when you start talking about ethics, there's a fork in the road that you run into pretty quickly. One of them, ethics is always about doing the right thing. It's like not what you can do, but what you should do. And when you parse that a little bit, what you should do has 2 branches on that tree. One of them is what you as a society should do about a big policy issue. And the other one is what you as an individual should do. And the society part of the answer seems to be pretty well tuned to the traditional ethics questions about what is right. What you should do as an individual is much more personal, much more behavioral, and seems to be very well tuned to your approach. And I just sort of wanted your reaction to this, because if I'm heading in the wrong direction here, it would be great to know that before I fall off the cliff.
I don't think you're ever heading the wrong. You're very thoughtful about this stuff, Rick. The way I think about, if I'm understanding your question, the way I think about that is this approach certainly would help people as an individual dealing with an individual issue. However, many of the kinds of ethical conflicts people face in organizational contexts, whether it's an engineering firm or some other kind of organization, are more systemic. It's not just that you told me to do something that was wrong and I had to figure out how to deal with you. It's something that's a little more embedded. And that's also true, culturally too. I've worked in countries and regions where certain forms of corruption are pretty much baked in. And so it's a systemic issue. And that, of course, needs to be addressed systemically. No one individual is going to fix that. But on the other hand, when that would come up in my classes, the students kind of saw that as a get out of jail free card. It's a systemic issue. I don't need to deal with it. I just have to do as the Romans do. And what we like to do with GVV is point out that actually the way systemic issues change is systemically, but that takes a bunch of individual issues. A bunch of individual actions. And it often means thinking more incrementally, more long-term. It may mean really working collaboratively across sectors and also organizations. So we actually have worked in, we did a program funded by the UN a number of years ago where we worked on, I think it's 10 cases that were on anti-corruption in India. Some of the cases people tried and failed. Some of the cases people tried and succeeded, but it was a much more iterative, complex process to get that change, And so I think GVV still is effective, but you have to be clear-eyed and realistic about how you would actually do that.
Great. I think Roz has agreed to keep us tuned in to questions that are being raised by the audience. So I'm just going to turn this over to Roz for a while.
Thank you. And it looked like we had a hand up for a while, but that went down. And we have 3 questions in the Q&A. So what we'll do is from the Q&A, I will read the questions, but if there's someone who would actually like to speak directly, please put your hand up. I'll be watching both and we will bring you in that way. So for the first question in the Q&A was from Jennifer Atchison, and she says, I teach senior design. The students are required to assess their project through the lens of ethics, and the students really struggle with this. What would you recommend? How can I make this a more valuable exercise for them?
Well, I guess it kind of depends on what the project is and what is in the rest of the syllabus. My guess is that you've discussed a number of kinds of design challenges in the course, and then that the students work either individually in teams to develop projects. That's my guess from your question. And if that is the case, I would imagine that what I would do is try to have in some of those earlier discussions before they're actually totally engaged in their project, that there be some examples of a design project that has some sort of ethical or values challenges embedded in it, so that they get the chance to practice using some of the GVV methodology there. And then when they're pitching their projects, I assume you have to approve them. And I assume there's certain questions they have to answer. And some of them may have to do with the values or the ethics that may be implicit in those. You might have to unpack those questions. Maybe you already do. I don't want to make assumptions, but you might have to unpack some of those questions to talk about, who are the various parties or groups or stakeholders or affected groups that may be affected by this project, and talk about the positive and negative possible effects. And then you might ask them to explicitly address how they're going to avoid some of the negative impacts that they've identified, or how they're going to explicitly pursue some of the positive aspects. So the example I'm thinking of is, we hear a lot about embedded biases in AI systems, so it'd be pretty, I think, obvious to ask them to think about what kinds of assumptions is your system likely to be based on, and what impacts might those have, and how can you make sure that all the parties that should be engaged are in the conversation. I think a lot of those things involve having sort of a human-centered design, sort of an engaging conversation with all the potential affected parties while you're in the design process. And so I could imagine developing a set of questions that they would need to address, rather than simply asking, what are the ethical implications, which I think people can go white, they can go blank. So maybe if you break it down into some of those kinds of questions, I'd be happy to brainstorm with you.
Thank you.
Rick, you might have some thoughts about that, because I know at Olin, the students, didn't they all have to do that kind of a design project? Did you have any thoughts on that?
Olin is kind of an unusual place, so I'm not sure how widely applicable this is, but Olin kids, when they graduate, have completed between 25 and 35 design build projects, and the core of it is human-centered engineering. So we constantly think of engineering design as starting with people and ending with people. So you often go to a nursing home and interview 10 people for 2 hours each about their lives, and before you begin to design, so the ethical issues show up in matching the values of the person you're designing for. So that kind of centers the conversation there. But I think there's another kind of ethics that's becoming more important today, and those are what I call unintended consequences. Mm-hmm. So you design something with all good intentions, and you're designing for a particular client base, but you don't know, it might be used for reasons that it was not intended for. And what is your responsibility in dealing with that? We're seeing this a lot in the software industry now, and in a lot of other societal applications. Engineers play a key role in that area. And I think we need to find ways to open that conversation.
Thank you both. There is a question from Sarah Leach. I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to press this button that says answer live. I don't know what it does, but we'll have to see. The question is,
experiment.
Does an assessment progression exist, like emerging, developing, proficient, We use this strategy to evaluate student mastery of other competencies in the curriculum. Now I'm going to press this button. I don't know what happened, but at any rate, there's the question.
So nothing happened on my screen, but,
Okay.
but maybe it happened somewhere. I don't know. There are folks who have developed rubrics for evaluating and grading in the business context for the use of GVV, largely because in the business context, in order to be accredited, I mean, you have the similar things in engineering, but in business, the accreditation process requires an assessment of learning in all the areas, including ethics. And so there's actually an article that one of my colleagues developed after I worked with her to integrate GVV into her business school's entire curriculum. And I imagine that rubric might be something that would give ideas for an engineering context. So if whoever asked that question is interested, they can feel free to email me and I'll send them the article. But it's simply a rubric for evaluating their responses. What you'll see when you get deeper into the GVV curriculum is that there's like 7 pillars, and we've identified the most common reasons and rationalizations, and we have sample responses to them. And there's a protocol of questions we ask people to work through when they deal with a giving voice to values scenario. All of those things translate, I think, into a kind of rubric for assessment. I just didn't go through all that verbally today, but I'm certainly happy to share that with whoever is asking that question if she emails me.
Thank you. We'll have to make sure we get your email.
Oh yeah, it's gentilium at darden.virginia.edu.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. All right, Linda Anthony has a question, and then it looks like she has an addendum to her question, so I'll read both. Has anyone approached you about developing this approach to deal with issues of systemic racism, white privilege, dominant class, policing, etc.? If so, can you say more about it? If not, would you consider this? And then the addendum says, applies to engineering fields as well as more generally as dominant class in engineering in workplace as well as in academia has historically been straight white male.
Right. It's a great question. Before I developed GVV, when I was teaching at Harvard Business School, I developed and taught their first course on I guess in those days we called it managing diversity, which is not what now we would call it diversity and inclusion. But yes, there are already some cases in the GVV curriculum, and there's hundreds of pieces of material, most of them for free, that you can get from, it's just givingvoicetovalues.org at Darden. But we do have some cases that deal with those issues. I also designed and taught the first course at Harvard Business School on managing diversity, and have some frameworks from that work that have migrated into the GVV curriculum. Also, I have a Giving Voice to Values book series with Routledge Publishing. And so people who are going to write about any issue that they're knowledgeable about from a positive solution action orientation, a GVV orientation, I will invite them into this series. And I've just signed a really remarkable woman she's a lawyer, but she's writing specifically about GVV tactics for addressing racial challenges and bias. And actually, I think I'm going to get the first draft of the manuscript this week, so it should be out by the summer. But whoever is asking that question, again, feel free to email me and I can point you to some things.
And now we have 3 questions from anonymous attendee, and I don't know if it's all one person or 3 different people, but let's start with the first question. Can you talk about how GVV cultivates moral agency? In the engineering field, we sometimes face the barrier, the comfort that comes from the clarity of just solving the problem you're given.
Yeah, I mean, that's what GVV is all about, right? Moral agency. You got it. And the way that we're trying to do that is literally by creating this muscle memory, this habit, this practical there's practice and practicing with your peers. That's part of it too. The process that we use when we have a GVV scenario, I called them the GVV thought experiment. They're short little cases and they end with someone who knows what's right. And the question is, how can they get it done? And we have a protocol of questions to work through, but usually we have them work on them in teams, in groups, and then come and share them in the larger class, share their solutions, and then engage in a kind of formal peer coaching. It's not role playing because usually role playing is set up adversarial. And so you really have half your people are practicing the negative, negative approach, but it's more, we're all on the same side and we're trying to create the most effective script and action plan to get this done. And so, and again, it's what if you felt this way. So we're not asking anyone to commit to it until they actually feel that there is an option. I find that if you ask people, give people a scenario, a case, and ask them, what would you do? You get three kinds of answers, and none of them sort of encourage this agency we're talking about. One of them is you get the people who would say, I would do the right thing. And they may really mean it, but we know from experience they often don't. Okay. And then we get the people who would say, I know what you want me to say, but it's just not realistic. It's not possible in the real world. And these people may be just trying to be really honest, or they may be playing devil's advocate. And then the third group you get are the people who say, I'll argue with the premise. It's not wrong, right? So any one of those answers, even if sincerely given, doesn't get you to the kind of practice and building muscle memory and developing scripts and action plans that we're talking about. And so we don't ask that question. Instead, we ask, what if you were this person who thought this was the right thing to do? How could they get it done? Because what we're trying to do is have it so that you actually have, we don't ask you what you would do until you actually have mental models, arrows in your quiver of how this could happen. You've seen positive examples in our cases. Our cases are all built on real situations. You've seen positive examples of how people have done this, and you've practiced with your peers voicing these kinds of things. And it's that rehearsal, that practice, that builds that moral agency. And I know what you mean about just being focused on getting to the right answer. It's very clear in engineering. It's also clear in business. We have the 7 pillars for GVV, and one of them has to do with purpose, and it has to do with defining the goal more broadly, rather than making your quota this quarter, that kind of thing. And that's not something that you just tell people and it's done. You have to rehearse ways of saying that you could imagine coming out of your mouth in an organization where everybody else is saying something else. And yet we see this happening. We see it working. I'll give you one quick example, which I think is kind of compelling. It's very hard to do empirical research on, the impact of this, because you take a course and then 2 years later you have an ethical issue and there's a lot of noise in between, and you can make correlative arguments. It's hard to make causal arguments about that. That's true with any kind of ethics training to a certain extent, or just soft skills. But there were a couple of faculty who taught accounting, which is one of the harder subjects in business. Harder as in hard and soft, not hard as in difficult. And they came to me because they were really trying. Accounting, like engineering, is requiring ethics education in order to get your license. And so they had tried really hard to build ethics into their accounting curriculum for their majors over the 4 years. And they, at senior year, they gave their students an exercise and they said, answer this exercise, submit your answers at this website, and then go to this other website. But don't go to the second website till you've submitted your answers, because it'll tell you the answers, right? And they could tell, and almost all the students went to the second website before they turned in their answers. And these faculty were, chagrined. They'd spent 3 years trying to, build them to think about ethics. And that's when I met them. And so then they built ethics, they built GVV in moving forward. And so by the time they got to another group of seniors and they ran the same exercise, none of them went to the other website before they submitted it. Now, you can't say that's because of GVV. It's hard to make those causal links in research, but it's pretty provocative. And I really do think it's part of what they're building this muscle memory, this moral agency, as you put it. So it's through rehearsal and practice and peer coaching, importantly, not just faculty. It's with their peers, because they're learning to say these words to each other and not feel like idiots. You know, they're learning that they can say these things intelligently, and they're not saying that's wrong. They're making much more nuanced arguments, and they're talking about the impact on the organization's ability to function, or on the impact of the product, or whatever the issue is.
Thank you. I'm noting a couple of points in the Q&A I want to bring out before we get to the questions. One says, please send a link to the article out to the group if possible, so Professor Gentile doesn't get hammered with emails. Now, the other way we can do that is if you send that link to us in the OEC, we can put it in the after webinar message that goes out tomorrow. And so you can look for it there.
I'll do that.
Yeah, the other follow-up, what resources are available to help others implement the GVV method? Where can we find them? So if there's anything there you want to include, we can put it. But I also want to remind everyone that Mary and I are working on an adaptation of her GVV course specifically for engineering education. Faculty can give that link to students and assign particular units, and it will have some of these cases in them. Interviews with engineers who have stumbled over questions of values, et cetera. That'll be a little while, but we're working on it. So I hope to offer that resource through the OEC. So the next question, another anonymous attendee says, hi all, thanks for organizing this. I would like to ask how we can reduce the resistance, ignorance of faculty on teaching ethics in engineering courses. What can be done by institutions to close the gap? My observation is the lack of knowledge creates a big resistance and lack of confidence in the faculty. I am going to turn this over to you, Mary, but I have to plug OEC. That's one of the things we're working on. So please join the site and come and look at the kinds of resources we're developing, or join a community of practice for teaching engineering ethics. All right, Mary, it's yours.
Yeah, and I would also invite Rick to respond to that one too, since he's been in a leadership role in several engineering schools. But that's actually why we developed GVV the way we did, because we were getting a lot of resistance from business school faculty for the reasons that Rick and I talked about a little while ago. And so what we were trying to do is to create a curriculum and an approach that was pretty easy for them for faculty to integrate into their curriculum, that actually meant the students were talking about the things that you talk about in your class anyways, as opposed to taking time out to talk about a philosopher. They weren't getting into these nuanced ethical debates. They were really getting into practice. And so everything that we've done to design GVV has been to try and address that. So I spend basically all my time traveling around, both to companies, organizations, but also to schools, sharing this. And when I go to schools, I'm often sharing it with faculty. And so we, and in our cases, our materials have teaching notes, to give faculty ideas. The program that I'm working on with Roz is a MOOC that we've actually created. It's at Coursera. It was created with Darden, on giving voice to values for ethical leadership. And most of the examples in there are business examples, but we're going to adapt it for engineering examples. And so I think all of those things can, make this feel less alien and less like it's something that's taken away from what they need to be focusing on. But I just wanted to give Rick a chance to say if there's anything you wanted to add, having been in that role of trying to encourage faculty.
Well, trying to encourage faculty, as has been said, is a little bit like herding cats. But you find the group of willing people who have real credibility and work with them. And over time, it tends to shape the culture. I found, for example, two things that might be interesting for engineering leaders. One of them is there's a fair amount of momentum been building over the last 20 years for climate change as being a science-based issue that affects the health and well-being of the planet. That's an ethical issue on a very large scale, not so much on a personal scale. There are others, and what we call the grand challenges for engineering, that include global health. Maybe you've heard of pandemics, cybersecurity globally and the impact that could have on destabilizing political structures across the globe and even warfare. And of course, the idea of that we want our children to have at least as good a life as we do, which is not going to happen as the population keeps exploding unless we pay much more attention to diversity, equity, and inclusion and all sorts of how we share limited resources with each other across the globe. So there's these issues that kind of, I mean, we have about 100 universities now across the globe who are adopting a curriculum in that area. Well, the ethical dimensions to that are implicit and require an explicit kind of response. So that's one thing. How do you find faculty who are willing to step out on the thin ice and make a statement? One of the things that I've found, find out which faculty members have children who are first or second year students in college. Turns out the conversation that happens over the dinner table on the weekends is different in those houses. And I found more success in finding volunteers from that group of faculty members and from others who seem to be doing just fine without confronting this. And of course, we have a time in our country's history where this skill and this moral courage to stand and speak the truth when it appears to be never less popular than in any time in my lifetime is a critical skill. And I think people recognize that. So I wouldn't be afraid to bring this up in a faculty meeting and ask for people who want to start a conversation.
Very good. We have someone from, thank you, from Cranfield University in England. And I want to read that question, give a quick response, and then also note we're coming down to the last couple of minutes. So Guy Grattan in Cranfield University in England, writing on engineering ethics myself, my single biggest problem has been that whilst it's relatively easy to find and analyze cases where there were significant ethical features, a much harder problem has been of finding good industry-centered cases where good practices were followed and good outcomes achieved. Have you been up against that? And if so, how have you found solutions? We certainly have, and we're trying to address that gap at the OEC. My understanding about GVV cases is that they are precisely about good outcomes. Is that true, Mary?
We try as much as possible to feature cases where somebody was successful, yes, but we don't shy away from if we have a case where we think it's really interesting and good learning, where the person tried and failed, we'll put it in, we'll talk about what they did, and then the GVV discussion is about what might they have done that would have been more successful. So we'll still give them, they'll still be engaged with the scripting and action planning, but there'll be a little bit of diagnosis of why what someone tried was not as effective as they might have hoped. So we'll do that. The broader question about looking across industry rather than looking at a particular organization, we haven't done that with GVV in business so far, but that's a really interesting question, and it might be something that in the project that we're doing, Roz, that we might actually do an interview on that.
That's what I'm hoping. Yes. I'd like to, because we're at close to the end, I'd like to say to Cindy Rotman and Doug Melton and Kim Wolfenbarger, thank you for your questions. Perhaps we'll find a way to respond to them offline. At this point, we have to close out the session, but I want to say thank you so much to our guests. Thank you so much. And I also, of course, have to plug the OEC and say our next speaker series is coming up on April 5th, Ethics Across the Curriculum, Ethics in Disciplines and Cultivating Ethics Literacy with Dr. Jonathan Beaver, University of Central Florida, and discussant Dr. Allison Kerr, National Center for Professional Ethics, Research Ethics. I think I stopped share. And Dr. Richard Miller, discussant, Dr. Mary Gentile, lecturer, amazing. And I'm so excited that we'll be working together through the Online Ethics Center. The link to the center is now in the chat. We have just gone live with our new center. It's still being finished, but it's ready at least for you to take a look at. Please join the center and come back for the next year and in the series. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Rick, too.
Thank you. Great to see you again.
Thanks, Roz.
Thank you.